How the Falcons offense performs over the next two games may tell us everything about how they'll perform over the rest of the season.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Mazda. Like our players, we sweat every detail because when you make every move count, pulling off the unexpected is only the beginning. Stay tuned for highlights this week's Moving the Game Forward. Mazda, move and be moved. So today's Locked On Falcons, we will be talking about sort of big picture stuff, given that we don't have a Falcons game to recap due to the bye week. I'll share my thoughts on some of the anti-pistol rhetoric that has been so pervasive when talking about the Atlanta Falcons over the first month and why, this team could benefit from operating more under center, but what's sort of stopping them from trying. We'll also talk about sort of what these next two games could tell us about this team the rest of the season. But, why you should be listening to me. Of course, I should introduce myself. I am none other than Aaron Freeman, your humble host. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers, that means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, as we, before we look back over the first month of the season during this bye week, let's look ahead because I think these next two games are going to be potentially huge litmus tests for this Falcons offense in particular, because Buffalo, who the Falcons' next opponent, who they play in week 6 on Monday Night Football, and then San Francisco, who they follow up in week 7, are, potentially two of the better defenses that the Falcons are going to face for the remainder of the season. These are two teams with playoff aspirations, potentially Super Bowl aspirations, right? If you go to FanDuel Sportsbook right now, Buffalo currently, as of this recording, has the best odds to reach the Super Bowl. And San Francisco has like the 4th best odds of winning the NFC. So, these are teams that have, hopes of making deep postseason runs, while the Falcons are sitting here just hoping, hey, we're just trying to get into the dance at this point in time. But, with these two defenses in particular, Buffalo is 9th in EPA, expected points added against the pass, entering week 5. San Francisco is 9th in EPA against the run. And I think these two games will be great measuring sticks for this Falcons offense. We saw the Falcons start to kind of figure things all out offensively last week against Washington, putting up 34 points. A big part of that was getting the quick game going. But I'm less convinced that that same offense that we saw last week is going to be the same offense that we're going to see consistently throughout the rest of the season, and especially over these next couple of games. But they have an opportunity to kind of prove that, right? And sort of the theme of today's episode is going to be a lot of like, I'll believe it when I see it. And we'll talk more about that later when it comes to the expectations going into the season for the Falcons offense. But, I think the main key is going to continue to maintain some of the things that they were able to do against Washington, right? We know this run game is going to continue to be an element that's going to be a challenge, specifically against San Francisco, operating that quick passing game when defenses are able to take away some of those explosive plays, as teams have so successfully been able to do this year, having that, short and intermediate passing game, and then hopefully getting some of the explosive plays that we started to see the team start to generate last week against Washington, those 20-plus yard plays. We need the kind of similar Kirktober spike that we saw a year ago, that after a slow start when it came to explosives. We talked about, how this team got off to a slow start explosively. And then in the month of Kirktober, right, in October, they had a huge spike in explosive plays. They were tied for 5th in the league just in terms of 20-plus yard plays last year in the month of October. Last year, going into October, we were talking about how this was one of the slowest starts from an explosive standpoint the Falcons have ever had, right? Since I've been tracking the number of explosive 20-plus yard plays, it was the slowest start since I've been tracking that in 2010. And I look back even further today, And it goes all the way back to 2002, where they had a slower start, where they had 10 explosive plays in the first 4 games combined last year. You had to go all the way back over 20 years to 2002, where they had 9 explosive plays in that season. And this year, they're currently at 11 through 4 games. But, again, as Raheem Morris says, don't worry, we don't get off the slow start. So, that doesn't mean anything. But, I think getting Darnell Mooney more involved in the offense, which he has not really been through the first couple of games due to injuries and other factors, and he continues to be nursing a hamstring injury. So that's going to be a challenge moving forward. But I think that's going to be a huge, potential boost. If this offense is going to start making those explosive plays, it's going to get a huge boost from Darnell Mooney, who absolutely went off in that month of October last year. And, similar to last week against Washington, if this offense is going to take off, like we hope it does, I think it's going to be from getting contributions from those key contributors, right? We obviously know Bijan Robinson is off to a great start. We know Kyle Pitts is off to a good, one of his best starts ever. And hopefully he can sustain that. Drake finally came alive last week, and hopefully there is more to come in that regard. And it's kind of Mooney is the last one standing when we talk about the big 3 or the big 4, now that Pitts is part of that element because he's producing. And it's not necessarily you have that big 3 plus 4 or whatever that, it's going to lead to everybody eating on any given week. Because there are going to be some weeks where some of those guys are quiet. Some of those guys are going to be taken away. But you want those weeks where one of those guys is quiet that somebody else went off, that you can look back and say, yeah, we had 3 catches for 28 yards from Kyle Pitts, but we had 8 catches for 124 yards from Drake or Darnell that week or whatever, so that you're consistently getting 3 of your 4 top playmakers at the skill position players playing at a high level, so you can kind of be that pick your poison type of offense. And, we talked a lot about this offseason about, what's the best case scenario for the Falcons offense. And I know there was a lot of hype, and we talked about it on the podcast, but there was a lot of hype that this could be like the 2016 year, that second year of Kyle Shanahan. And to me, one of the things that in terms of the best version of the Falcons offense to me was always going to be a little bit more like the 2012 offense, which was also a pick your poison type of offense that had, Roddy White and Tony Gonzalez and Julio Jones. And it wasn't that all of those guys ate every week, but almost every single week, one of those guys had a big game. And, the main difference is from that 2012 offense to the 2025 Falcons is that 2012 unit, besides Julio, was a veteran unit. You had Matt Ryan and Roddy White and Tony Gonzalez, all veteran players at that point in time. You even had a veteran offensive coordinator. That was year 1 of Dirk Cutter back in 2012, the first time Dirk Cutter was the offensive coordinator here in Atlanta. But that was his 6th NFL season in terms of experience calling plays. And so the question with the Falcons is, can you achieve similar results with a first-year starting quarterback instead of a 5th-year starting quarterback, where 3 out of your 4 main, skill guys are on rookie contracts with a second-year offensive coordinator as opposed to the proven veterans at that point in time? And I think it's possible, certainly by years in, but I don't think in the meantime it's going to be a super smooth ride. Given some of these upcoming opponents, especially over the next couple of games, it'll be a pleasant surprise to me if we see that version of the Falcons offense, that fully formed version of the Falcons offense over these next 2 games. But I do think these 2 games are going to be great litmus tests. By the way, Buffalo and San Francisco going into week 5 were 2 of the defenses that had given up the fewest amount of explosive plays in the entire NFL through 4 games, right? They were both, top 5 or bottom 5, depending on how you view it, right? But in terms of being, in the top 5 teams in terms of fewest allowed, right? Bottom 5, depending on, how you sort of view that. Now, we say that entering week 5 because San Francisco got kind of cooked by the Rams in terms of explosive plays, gave up a ton of explosive plays in that Thursday night game. I'm recording this before the Sunday night game that Buffalo will be playing, so we'll see on that front. But, basically I bring that up just because if the missing element of the Falcons offense is explosive plays, at least against Buffalo. We'll see what San Francisco looks like. But at least against Buffalo is probably not conducive for suddenly you to go off and have your get right game against them, but we'll see how that goes. So, we've talked before about the struggles on offense being because this offense is geared towards that vertical offense. We've had opponents taking that vertical pass away. We haven't been able to generate those explosive plays down the field in large part due to the slow start from Darnell Mooney. And, the struggles in the first 3 games were primarily, in my opinion, because the Falcons didn't have good answers in terms of quick and short intermediate passing game, other than just, hey, we're just going to run the football. And that running game was only really that effective in that week 2 game and was less effective in the weeks 1 and 3 game. And that was a big contributing factor to why the Falcons offense and the team struggled in those 2 games. But we saw last week against Washington them kind of get those things right. They had much better answers. The short, quick passing game was much more effective. And to me, that was a big reason why the team's offense was finally able to get going. And hopefully that will continue. But that wasn't the pervasive narrative going into that Washington game, especially coming off of the Carolina game. It had been sort of pervasive that, everybody was talking about, the Falcons offense is struggling because they're, utilizing too much pistol, they're too predictable and all that stuff. I felt like that stuff has been overblown. And I kind of want to get into that. The one that isn't quite overblown is the lack of under center offense in this offense, but let's break it all down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. This episode is brought to you by Square, where your favorite neighborhood spots run on Square. There are certain businesses that make the neighborhood the neighborhood, right? These are the places that become an extension of your home, whether it's the sports bar dedicated to your favorite team's fan base, the spot with the best wings in town, which are perfect for game day, or that beloved local chain that's rooted in your community for many, many years. These businesses are what bring people together. And when the neighborhood businesses thrive, the whole neighborhood thrives. And, especially given that this is an off week, this is a perfect opportunity for you guys to, use this ad as an excuse to go support your favorite local spot and have yourself a day in the neighborhood when you don't have to necessarily worry about Atlanta Falcons playing on any given Sunday. And Square is a proud partner of more than 4 million neighborhood businesses around the world. You can go to square.com/go/LockedOnNFL to learn more. But before you do, make sure you go support your favorite neighborhood spot. Square, see you in the neighborhood. And this episode is also brought to you by Mazda's Moving the Game Forward. For those who believe it's not just about playing the game, it's about redefining it. There are moments that do more than put points on the board. They move crowds, move culture, and keep moving the game forward. And this week's moment that moved the game forward was, brought to you by none other than Zac Robinson, who was a big part of the Falcons' improved quick game, their passing game, fueling, his career high 106 receiving yards, which helped fuel the Falcons' win over Washington last week. And when you follow what moves you, the unexpected is only the beginning. And just like there's more to every highlight, there's more to a Mazda vehicle. Mazda, move and be moved. So, we've talked about the predictability of the Zac Robinson offense here on this podcast, especially coming off of week 1, right? And to me, that predictability was based off of, when Bijan was in the game, they ran it up the middle. And when Tyler Algier was in the game, they ran it outside. And I feel like far too often the conversation and the rhetoric surrounding, the predictability is been centered, from at least what I've seen, mostly on like the Falcons run pass balance. And like, I think the mistake that people make is like, not all runs are created equal. Just knowing it's a run doesn't really help you all that much unless you know where the team is trying to run the football, right? Same thing with the pass, like who are they trying to throw the ball to matters. And I think that part of the conversation gets kind of lost, where people just sort of assume, oh, well, if the defense can guess it's a run or a pass or whatever, they're going to stop it. And that's not really true. And the reality is, far too much, I think the conversation has been, surrounded like, oh, the formation is dictating whether or not the Falcons are running or passing. And reality in the NFL is down and distance dictates whether it's a run or a pass, right? The only times, for those of you that don't know, that you have neutral run pass situations in the NFL are on 1st and 10 and 2nd and medium being 2nd and 4, 2nd and 5, 2nd and 6. Pretty much every other down and distance that you're going to have is going to skew, somewhat or heavily towards either a run or pass. And so defenses generally kind of know what you're doing based off of down and distance. Formation is not about dictating run or pass. Formation is about enhancing run or pass, right? And so down and distance is telling you whether you're going to run or pass or not. And so if it's a passing situation, you're going to go, for example, shotgun, because shotgun helps the pass, because shotgun gives quarterbacks more vision of what's going on defensively. as opposed to, under center stuff where quarterback often will turn his back to, the defense or at least half of the defense or whatnot. And so you see this, right, where teams overwhelmingly pass out of shotgun, right? Across the NFL this season, it's about a 73% pass rate in terms of shotgun passing. Now the Falcons are above the norm, which is 87% pass rate up to this point, which is high, but it's not as outrageously high as I think some people make it out to be, right? The Rams are right up there with an 87% pass rate, right, above the Falcons. And then you go back historically at these Rams offense, these Sean McVay level offenses with the Rams over the last couple of years since 2022, the Vikings under Kevin O'Connell, another McVay disciple since 2022. When he arrived in Minnesota, the Rams are 81% pass rate out of shotgun. The Vikings are 83% pass rate out of shotgun. So when you look at the, 87% for the Falcons, yes, it's at the extreme end of the spectrum, but it's not completely out of the norm for this coaching tree to be very much a heavy passing attack out of shotgun, right? And no one's sitting here saying like, oh, the Kevin O'Connell or Sean McVay offense is super predictable, except for when they run the ball in the fourth down play on the Thursday night game. But you know what I'm saying. So, for me, like the Falcons having more run balance out of their shotgun offense doesn't make a ton of sense, just because their wide zone run scheme isn't really conducive to running a ton of shotgun runs out of that, right? If you're going to run outside zone, as the Falcons so often do, to me, it's better out of pistol. And pistol is primarily a run formation, just like under center is primarily a run formation. You look at the averages run rates out of those two formations across the NFL, it's 67% for pistol, it's 70% for under center. And for those of you not familiar with what the pistol is, it's, kind of a jack of all trades, between shotgun and under center, right? That you with the quarterback standing back, 4 yards deep as opposed to, 7 yards deep, typically is in the shotgun. He's getting similar vision of the entire defense, more vision than he would get under center, but not quite to the same degree as shotgun. And you're also getting, similar run angles that you would get under center, that you wouldn't get under shotgun, right? Because the running back's going to line up, basically in the same spot under pistol as he would under center. Don't fall for the ESPN propaganda if you believe otherwise. And so, the Falcons run rate out of pistol is about 74%. So not that much higher than the league average of 67%, right? So nothing completely crazy. And it's funny to me because of all the pistol criticism is weird, because it's like the Falcons have been running a pistol forward offense since 2022, right? They've been running, roughly 40% of their offense out of pistol since the 2022 season. And yet this year, for some reason, is the first time I've ever really heard Falcon fans complaining about the Falcons' overuse of pistol and acting like it's some new development that's, like, oh, it's a bad thing. It's like, I don't get that. But, you're probably sitting there wondering, Aaron, well, hey, Aaron, you talked about the shotgun, you talked about the pistol, but what about the under center stuff, right? The Falcons are very run centric out of under center. And you're right. Their run rate on our under center is 92%, which is, again, is much more significant over the 70% NFL average. But, until like this last week, Philadelphia was also a 90% run team under center as well, because primarily the only time the Eagles get under center is when they're, running the ball in short yardage, which, how they do that with the tush push and whatnot. But, in general speaking, across the NFL, teams that run under center, teams that utilize under center are basically only go under center to either run the football or run play action, right? Only about, if my stats are correct, only about 5% of all under center plays are non-play action passes. So essentially you look at under center is like 70% run, 25% play action passes, and like 5% non-play action passes. And, the Falcons have called just 12 under center plays all season long. 3 of them were goal to goal situations. 3 of them were where they were backed up in their own 20-yard line. And so therefore we're trying to run the football to get better field position. And then 6 of them were third or fourth downs with 1 or 2 yards to go. So basically, late downs, short yardage situations. So the Falcons pretty much only go under center in goal line situations or short yardage situations is basically the norm. All right. And I think it's a valid criticism to basically say that the Falcons need to do more under center stuff, because they're far below the league average in terms of under center usage compared to the rest of the league. But unlike everybody else, I don't think the Falcons, I think the Falcons do have some legitimate reasons and or excuses, if you want to call them that, for why they don't go under center. I think one of those is Penix's lack of experience under center. I think the other is the fact that the Falcons do not really care about play action passing, which is a big part of operating under center. And then I think the other issue is concerns about the pass protection and whether or not going under center would open up, concerns about Elijah Wilkinson in that right tackle position, protecting the blind side, which have been mostly overblown, as we discussed throughout the summer. It was probably not going to be as big a deal as people made it out to be. But I think though at least two of those issues, Penix's lack of experience and the lack of play action being featured in the offense, are two more things that we can unpack, and we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the NFL season is here, and FanDuel wants to make sure you're ready with this can't miss offer right now. New customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. And with FanDuel, you can bet the spreads, you can bet the money line, you can bet player props, you can bet same game parlays, right? You can bet pretty much anything over at FanDuel. If you're feeling particularly optimistic on this stress-free Sunday where there was no Falcons football, and you're like, hey, the Falcons going to make the playoffs, Aaron, I don't care what you have to say, right? You can project the stage of elimination over at FanDuel, whether you project the team to miss the playoffs, lose in the wild card round, the divisional round, or make it beyond that. You can bet it all over at FanDuel. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today to get started. So we talked about Penix's lack of experience under center, right? That's something that stems from his days in college. He was primarily a shotgun and pistol quarterback in college, right? And, we saw this at the end of last year. The Falcons were not an under center offense when Penix, started those last 3 games last year, right? They dabbled in under center stuff under Kirk Cousins. About 20% of Kirk Cousins' snaps were under center, which is far fewer than what Kirk had been playing in for most of his career. But it was at least somewhat, a quote unquote normal amount of under center. But then once Penix got into the game, that number went from 20% to 8%. Right. And this year it's under 5%. So, it's clear that this team is not that interested in running under center stuff. And I think a big reason is that they're not that interested in dialing up play action, right? Last year with Penix under the helm, they ran play action 14% of the time. With Kirk under the helm, it was 13% of the time. This year, they've increased it to 18% of the time. So we were hoping going into the season that number would be somewhere in the 20s. In the upper 20s ideally, but the NFL average is in terms of usage of play action is about 25%. Now they did get to 21% last week against Washington, so hey, that's progress. You got to take, beggars cannot be choosers at this point in time. But again, why aren't the Falcons interested in these things? Again, Penix was primarily a shotgun and pistol quarterback in college, right? And we've had questions about whether or not he can turn his back to the defense and be effective, based off of that lack of experience working under center. And we broke that down in Washington, where you had a big time throw to Drake London over the middle, as well as a bad interception trying to throw to Drake London, down the seam or towards the sideline, I guess, where he did not see a defender. And then when you don't run really any under center offense at all, there's not a whole lot of growth potential when it comes to the sort of the play action stuff, because again, as we discussed, like a big part of operating under center is to better sell your play action, because teams look at that as primarily a run sort of, front and formation and whatnot. And so, as someone who was the originator, when it came to this offense's ceiling is going to be limited if they don't develop a more robust play action passing game, which was a constant talking point here on this illustrious podcast for pretty much the entire offseason. I'm 100 in favor of the Falcons trying to develop a more robust play action passing game, right? I think that absolutely should be the goal, and I hope that they get there at some point this season. But I guess for me, now that we're 4 games into the season and we haven't seen it develop, I'm kind of on the verge of giving up on that being a realistic expectation, right? It goes back to action speaking louder than words. And I remember when Zac Robinson did, I believe it was the Check the Mic podcast back in late May, and he was talking about dialing up more play action, and everybody kept hitting me up. Aaron, did you check the Mic? Did you hear Zac on Check the Mic with Sam Monson and Steve Palazzolo? And he was talking about using more play action. And I was just like, yeah, we'll see. And a lot of people were just like, oh, Aaron's just being a hater. Classic Aaron, just hating. And I'm just like, no, because I've covered this team in this sport for as long as I have, for almost 2 decades now. And so every offseason we hear all this hype and this talk about this is what this team is going to do, and it's easy for people to sit here and talk that talk in May and June. But then when we get to September and October, when you have to walk the walk, they're not showing up really as much. And that's basically why I was skeptical then of hearing all that rhetoric from Zac Robinson then, because I'm just like, all right, I'll believe it when I see it. That goes back to the earlier point I made. And so, basically I'm at a point now where if it was going to happen, it should have happened by now. Now, again, they're coming out of the bye week, and this is a time where teams make adjustments and whatnot. And so this is, to me, a key area of potential and growth coming out of this bye week. And basically their last chance for this to be a thing, the play action passing to be a core part of their offense. This is kind of their last chance. Like this next month or so, October is kind of it, right? And when we look at the upcoming games, it's going to be a challenge against Buffalo and San Francisco. But Miami is, at least based off going into week 5, was the 6th worst defense in the NFL against play action when you measure it by either EPA or yards per attempt. And so basically I'm at a stage where, if this play action passing attack doesn't come together by week 8, I can't imagine a world where it does come together. And even then, if it does, we'll just be like, well, that's just because Miami is bad against it. And then we'll have to sort of see if they can continue that against New England and Indianapolis at that stage in time. But I'm basically saying, if it doesn't come together against Miami, it's never going to come together is basically what I'm at, because that's really the team that you're most likely to have your quote unquote get right game when it comes to the play action attack. And so we'll wrap up here. I want to make this clear. I'm not saying that the lack of play action is okay. I want to see the Falcons dial up more play action. I want to see them go under center more, right? I want to have more data on trying to figure out if Michael Penix is good enough to operate under center, because that's going to impact his long-term future. Because, there's certainly a possibility that Zac Robinson is not the architect of this offense come 2026. And I think a lot of people are going to be like, oh, well, we'll get a new offensive coordinator and he's going to operate under center and he's going to operate play action. And that will solve all the whatever the offensive problems are, and we'll get a lot more consistent and high-flying offense. And it's like, sure, at face value, but if Michael Penix isn't good turning his back to the defense, I don't know if that's going to be as easy a solution as you think it is, right? And instead, if the Falcons are ever going to develop an effective play-action passing attack with Michael Penix at the helm, it may require them to have to completely revamp their run game, because if you're going to be an outside zone scheme, right, in the natural play action pass, that is going to be your bread and butter, is that sort of bootleg off of the stretch play that outside zone teams love to run, that the Falcons rarely ever run. But if you can't run that bootleg because Penix isn't good at that, then it kind of requires you, if Penix is going to be your long-term solution at quarterback, it kind of requires you to kind of revamp not only your run game, but potentially revamp your offensive line, because this offensive line is geared towards operating an outside zone heavy scheme. And if that's all they're good at, and it's just that marriage of run game to passing game, it might not work, is basically what I'm getting at. And so we need to figure that out, because obviously that has long-term ramifications, where it's just like, oh, well, we can't operate play action because we don't have the quarterback, or we don't have the offensive line. They don't match together. And so that's something that we need to figure out at this point in time. Again, that's an off-season issue, but you want to get as much information between now and that off season so you can have an informed decision. So I'm all for the Falcons doing more under center stuff, dialing up more play action. Absolutely. But I'm skeptical over whether we're actually going to see it between now and the off season. And so, I remember we had this conversation last December, and I know a lot of people were dismissive of that conversation back then. But when we talked about this, when the Falcons made the choice to bench Kirk Cousins over in favor of Michael Penix, right? And we talked about how, if you're trying to get that year 2 bump, you're less likely to get that because you're going to have a first-year starting quarterback rather than a second-year starting quarterback. Now, I'm not advocating that the Falcons made some egregious mistake by benching Kirk, tossing the keys to Michael Penix instead of rolling with Kirk Cousins. But to me, some of the struggles and the ups and downs of this going into the 2025 season should have been expected. But I think a lot of people, because of the offseason hype, were expecting this thing to be, hit the ground running and whatnot. And the reality may be that you're not going to get the quote unquote year 2 bump for Michael Penix until he gets to his third year, right? Which is 2026. Right. And so the big unanswered question is going to be whether Zac Robinson and company should be brought back for that third year. And a lot of that will depend on whatever in-season growth and consistency that they develop over the next 3 months. And so you want to get to that point later this season where you feel like this offense is a well-oiled machine, hopefully, with the Falcons winning enough games to justify it. But, looking like that top 10 unit that a lot of people, that we were all promised this offseason, right? And that will be a huge selling point for this coaching staff, which includes our boy, Zac Robinson, right? To maintain continuity going into their third year. And so this is part of the reason why, like, every week on this podcast is not really going to be a referendum, right? If we have an up week for the offense, we'll talk about the reasons why it's an up week. If we have a down week, we'll talk about the reasons why it's a down week. But to me, a lot of it's going to be a lot of big picture stuff of, not only what type of growth do we see for this team over the next 2 to 3 weeks offensively, but also it's really going to be about the growth that we see over the next 2 to 3 months. And so I want people to keep that in mind, to not necessarily automatically ride the emotional roller coaster of every week. It's like, oh, they had a down week, it's time to fire the coaching staff. Oh, they had an up week, oh, this team is going to go to a Super Bowl. That seems like an exaggeration, but that tends to be the type of feedback I often get, depending on whether or not the Falcons win and lose. And so we don't do that. We try to maintain in the middle. The team is never as good as you think they are coming off a win. They're never as bad as you think they are coming off a loss. So I just want to keep that in mind, because I know if we do have the ups and downs that I'm projecting in the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a lot of angry people. Like, why couldn't they, keep it going from what they did against Washington, terribleness and all that stuff. And so we'll see how that all plays out. But obviously we'll have more to talk about, heading into this Buffalo Bills game. And so continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen as we break that down over the next several days leading up to that Monday night matchup that will hopefully tell us a lot about how good this Falcon team can be. So continue to make Locked On Falcons by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, if you want to catch up on all the things that you may have missed in this Week 5 action with the Falcons off, Locked On NFL is going to have you covered. 2 shows daily. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.